So when you're sitting in your studio, do you ever get stuck for ideas? Or do you ever feel like what you're creating starts to sound too similar? Well, in this video, we're going to go over 3 creative strategies to help boost your musical creativity in your home studio. Well, creativity itself can be an extremely elusive subject, and staying productive while songwriting isn't always an easy task. However, sometimes one moment of clarity can help reignite that creative fire. Hey yo, it's Alex from Meta My Music, and with this channel, it's my mission to help musicians produce themselves by developing their mindset, expanding their creativity, and connecting to their inner artist in a deeper way. All right, so a lot of these ideas that we're going to talk about is just as much about the process and varying your approach as it is creating musical ideas themselves. Because at the end of the day, creativity is all about the approach, the strategy, and the process to help you get that next epiphany, right? To help you solve your musical problem, to help you move forward in your song. All right, so tip number 1 is build a streamlined recording set. All right, because even if you have an exquisite memory, if you have a memory palace and you can remember things easily, good ideas have lifespans. If your current setup involves plugging in cables, doing crazy routing, turning on machines, menu diving just to capture an idea, something is wrong. You want to be able to catch ideas as quickly and as efficiently as possible in your home studio. So if you have a MIDI controller, that's your central control unit, make sure it is front and center on your desk, right? For example, I have the Ableton Push 2, which is my main controller, and then I have this APC 40 as a secondary controller. And with these 2 controllers, I can capture pretty much any idea, whether it's a bass line, a melody, some effect, track routing, anything that you can think of is within reach. Okay, and that's super important. So another personal example of this is I'm a guitarist. I use the guitar to come up with many ideas, melodies, riffs, motifs, all sorts of things. So I always have one of my guitars right beside my desk, so it's easy to grab and play around with. And then I have all my other guitars closer by, but not right beside my desk. So you really want to give thought to what pieces of hardware do you use the most, which are most crucial to your setup, which are you most comfortable with. And if you're super adept at a tool like a synthesizer, or you play an instrument like bass, guitar, keys, you should have that instrument front and center at your studio, since it will be undoubtedly the thing you use the most to generate ideas. And if you have equipment that you barely touch that is taking up valuable desk real estate, you're kind of wasting the space. For example, I have this synth that is amazing, but I don't always use it. I only use it on occasion. So I store this on one of my storage shelves over there. And when I need to use it, I grab it and I bring it closer to my desk for the odd occasion that I use it. As opposed to my guitar and my MIDI controllers on my desk, I use these every single session. And again, the whole purpose behind setting up your studio in an ergonomic way is to make sure you can capture ideas as quickly as possible. As soon as you have an idea, you should be able to get it into the computer. And if you're a vocalist, or you like to come up with ideas by singing parts and then transposing it to other instruments, make sure you have a microphone plugged in and set up ready to go every time you open a new project. And I would also suggest that you have some default routing set in your audio interface so that you could have a microphone plugged in. You can have a 1/4-inch cable coming out to use with your guitar or some other external instrument already routed into your audio interface. So all you have to do is quickly plug it in, turn on a track, and you're good to go. So another huge part of capturing ideas as they come to you is being able to capture them at any point. So most of us have smartphones that we carry around with us absolutely everywhere we go, and most phones have a voice memo app. So I would highly recommend that if you have a rhythmic idea, if you have a lyrical idea, if you have a melodic idea, that you quickly record it as a voice memo, label it, and then you can reference it later. You can also find a music production app for Android or iOS to really help you get down ideas in a little bit more of a tangible way. And some of these apps are actually quite powerful, that you can very easily send the files to your main DAW, such as Ableton or whatever you might be using. And setting up this whole ecosystem is super powerful because anytime you have an idea, you can capture it and you can play with it later, right? You're never going to lose out on a glimpse of inspiration. So all that to say is make sure your studio is efficiently set up and optimized for efficient idea creation. All right, so number 2 is placing limitations on yourself and or gamifying the music making process. And the whole idea behind this is that in our modern music making environment, we are completely overwhelmed by options. We have infinite plugins, we have software instruments, we have effects, we have samples, we have all sorts of options of DAWs and routing and possibilities and ways to manipulate audio that it can be very easy to get overwhelmed by choice. This is also called analysis paralysis, and I'm sure you've experienced this. Anytime you're menu diving through presets, you're trying to choose what kind of sound to use or what kind of sample to use or how to use the sample or what kind of song you want to make, what tempo to choose, what kind of bass line, what kind of harmony, what scale. All of these choices just hinder us from actually creating. So as you're browsing for content on Netflix, you're introduced with all these different categories, you're introduced with the top picks, you're introduced with suggested for you, you're introduced with these subgenres and all these different choices and all these different recommendations that a lot of the time you end up browsing choices for a good 20, 30, 40 minutes before actually making a decision, right? So it's the same kind of principle, but towards our creativity and towards music production, right? So if you can set limits, if you can narrow the scope of your focus, it's going to help you be so much more creative. Because if you think about it, creativity is only useful when there's a problem to solve. And there's usually only a problem to solve when there are arbitrary limitations that you have to overcome. All right, so I'm gonna go over a few examples of how you could go about limiting your options when you start out your sessions. All right, so one of the strategies you could take is what is called this 4-player limitation. You want to think about almost if you were your own band, and you would simply choose an instrument, one instrument per band member. So you would have one instrument for your rhythmic section, so typically your drums, one instrument for your bass, one instrument for your melody, and one maybe extra instrument for pads or samples or one extra thing. And you're going to have 4 instruments on 4 tracks, and that's your limitation. That's all you're allowed to use to try and create your track. Another strategy you could use is simply using 1 or 2 plugins on multiple tracks to try and create a whole song. All right, and this is going to force you to get extremely creative with those 1 or 2 plugins in ways that you could have never imagined because you're limiting yourself to only using those 2. Another way you could go about this is using 1 or 2 samples and using creative ways to manipulate them and process them and pitch them up and down to create a whole song. You could also experiment with using different instruments if you play an instrument, or if you don't play an instrument, try to play an instrument. So for example, if I'm always using my guitar, I might consider using bass to start off the song instead. Or I might hop on my drum kit or play around with a synth, just something to change it up from what you regularly do. Another way you could go about it is simply selecting a scale to work within. So you could choose like C major, or you could choose like G sharp, Aeolian, or something more exotic like E flat harmonic minor. You can also experiment with a modulating chord progression, so a chord progression that works within 2 different scales, and this will help you really train your ear to follow along with the harmonic changes, and it will also probably stem some really awesome new ideas. And finally, you can play around with starting tracks in different ways than you usually start them. So if you usually start your tracks with a beat and then you lay a bass line and then you do your melody, maybe flip it around. Try finding a melody first or a chord progression, then find your bass line, then try to find a beat. Or maybe just start with a bass line and see what happens from there, right? And all of these examples revolve around the idea of intentionally setting limits for your creativity to help you discover new ways, new pathways to get to ideas, new thoughts you've never thought before, and really get you thinking in a new type of way. And if you modify your approach to get to new ideas or to finishing a track or to finding new exciting things for you, you're gonna break out of your normal pathways of creativity, right? You're gonna force yourself to forge new paths to find interesting ideas for you. All right, and number 3 is setting various types of micro goals. Because within music production, you can very easily hyper focus on an end result or on this giant dream vision that we have for a track, but often it takes time to get to that vision, and that vision can actually hinder us from doing the work that is required to get there. All right, if you feel like you have a lack of ideas or your creativity is kind of stagnating, setting micro goals will help unblock you. All right, the immediate feedback that you get from completing micro goals will help keep your motivational flame alive. All right, and before we dive into some examples, you want to always keep in mind that you want to keep a healthy balance between challenging yourself and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, but also not too far that you lose familiarity with what you're already good at. All right, so you want to keep it fun, but you want to keep it challenging. All right, one example of this is thinking in broad strokes. Okay, because when we're working on a project, it's so easy, especially in our modern studio age, to get lost in details, all right, to get over analytical about ideas way too early, and it actually hinders our progress instead of accelerating. And don't get me wrong, zooming in and paying attention to detail is what's going to make your art stand out, and what true great art is truly made of is super fine attention to detail. However, if we place too much attention to detail too quick in the beginning, it can actually hold us back, right? We've all been there where focusing on something takes 15 minutes, 30 minutes, before you know it, 2 hours have gone by and very little progress has been made, and then your motivation starts to wane. All right, a great analogy for this is as you're participating in creating your music, creating your track, try to see the process itself, so you coming up with ideas, putting it together, trying new things, as a story. And a story doesn't focus too much on any single character at any given point in time. It keeps the narrative rolling. And I encourage you to think about your sessions this way. So think of the different musical parts you're focusing on as different characters in your story. And while you're coming up with ideas and developing these characters, you're not going to hyper focus on one character while leaving all the other ones behind. Snare drum. You're going to actually develop all the characters at the same time to create an overarching narrative. However, there might be a main character, or there might be a focus on a certain character at a certain point in the story. The whole point of this analogy is you want to think this way as you approach working on different parts of your song. And whether it's keeping a reader's attention, a viewer's attention, or a listener's attention, you have to keep their attention by keeping a consistent development of characters, or consistent development of sounds, consistent development of footage to really keep someone engaged, right? And this whole broad strokes idea will only work if you can commit to moving on when parts even aren't perfect yet. If the timing isn't perfect, if the harmony isn't perfect, if the take isn't perfect, you can still move on to start developing other ideas and start developing the bigger picture of the song, and then you can always go back and edit and retrack stuff later. Right, the whole key is you want to try and keep the creative fire alive. You want to approach your creativity in a way that will keep you in flow state, keep you excited, keep you trying new ideas, keep you modifying things and moving forward. Right, another example for focusing on micro goals is to focus on the foundation first. And typically the foundation of music is, like we mentioned before, the rhythm and the bass. And if you come up with a few drum beats and a couple awesome bass lines, you already have a lot of the rhythmic content and harmonic content of a chord progression built into that foundation. And from that foundation, it's going to be a lot easier to build up melodies, to build up progressions, and to build up dynamic movement across your track. Another strategy is to start with what you hear. And most musicians don't actually get spontaneous ideas. It usually comes from active work and an active process of trying things that stems ideas. However, if you have an idea in your head, like a melody, or you've been drumming a rhythm on a table, use it. And I assure you that the ideas you get outside of your typical creative environment, so your studio, so whether you're on a walk, whether you're waiting in line for coffee, whether you're stuck in traffic and you get an idea, typically those ideas will be a lot more interesting and unique. So if you have something in your head, definitely explore it. All right, and finally, the last strategy for setting micro goals or focusing on small chunks in your music production session is to really start with what you know. So if you already know how to play an instrument, like if you play guitar or if you play piano or if you play bass, even if you don't intend on using that instrument in your track, definitely utilize the instrument that you're familiar with, because your organic connection and the organic knowledge that you have and the musicality that you've developed through that instrument will take you so much farther than trying to struggle with something that you might not be as familiar with. And typically, like if you play guitar, the way that you voice chords on the guitar will be extremely different than if you play piano and you voice chords on the piano. Or if you're a drummer and you play an electronic kit and you program in MIDI notes that way, or you have your whole kit set up and recorded, you're going to play significantly different beats with a different feel than jamming out on a MIDI controller and finger drum. All right, so whatever medium you are strongest in, whatever you resonate with the most, I encourage you, start with what you know. And you can always transpose the ideas you come up with on your instrument of choice or whatever you're most familiar with to other sounds or other instruments later as you work on your song. And hey, if you're just getting started with music production and feeling just completely overwhelmed or having trouble finishing projects, or would just like to see a glimpse inside my personal workflow, I've created an easy 7-step pro producer roadmap to help you go from your very first ideas all the way to a finished mix and master. And I've packed it full of awesome mixing and recording tips that I've learned over the years. It's super handy to have around the studio as a printout, so if you're interested in grabbing that, the link is below. Hey, let me know, have you found any awesome creative strategies or approaches that have really helped you generate a lot of awesome ideas? If so, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to know. I'd love to start a conversation. And with that said, I will see you in the next video.